Hello, welcome to a lecture introducing the concept of external audit. We're just going to be looking at it in this short video about what it means, what is the purpose of it, and how it relates to the overwhelming and the overriding considerations of strategy and its use and its understanding of the works of Sun Tzu, and how they still are among the best illuminations of an approach to strategic ideas. For this, therefore, I'm going to look at 5 particular quotes of Sun Tzu. Measurement owes existence to earth, estimation of quantity to measurement, calculation to estimation of quantity, balance of chances to calculation, and victory to balancing of chances. The way he looked at the concept of measurement and understanding and how important it was. How he looked at the fact that earth comprises distances great and small, danger and security, open ground and narrow passes, and the chance of life and death, i.e. much broader than simply earth as in geography. How understanding the place and time of the coming battle, we may concentrate from the greatest distances in order to fight, trying to work out what is coming and what is coming ahead. Obviously we cannot predict the future, but we can start to understand and calculate some of the influences of that. And understanding that the elements of which he talked were not always predominant, that at different times other different things were more important, and you have to understand this flexibility. And finally, we understand that we cannot enter into allowances until we are acquainted with the designs of our neighbours. We must understand what the purposes are there. Quite often we enter into alliances with people which we clearly have big agreements, but there may be other times in which we can enter into alliances for various reasons, and it may be related to what they're definitely wanting to do, but it may also be related to the fact that there are things that we can find in common and work together on. So let's proceed onwards. First, we look at this idea of measurement and why is it important, and why is it important today of the things that we'll be looking at. And this is a way of looking at it from the point of view of the general big picture of a strategy. This is strategic staccatis, which of course is referred to in other of my videos and explains the idea of strategy as the practical implementation of the tools. And it's understanding the limitations of the measurements you take, but also make sure that you are measuring the correct thing. We've seen in many examples of strategy, and one that I often use, of course, is the American War in Vietnam, where the Americans were measuring the wrong thing. In fact, in Afghanistan, when the Defence Secretary referred to the fact that America did not do body counts, and many people assumed it as a cynical attitude, actually it was a recognition that body counts do not tell you whether you're winning or losing the war. This was the mistake that was made in Vietnam, where they published body counts every night and assumed that this was a sign of victory. This was repeated actually quite common. It wasn't just them, it was also repeated by Rhodesia. Obviously, they would regularly publish body counts of clashes between security forces and the resistance, the liberation armies, and the liberation armies often took heavier casualties, but in fact they were winning the war, as is the case elsewhere in Vietnam. The Americans have learned to a certain extent this use of measurement, if you're measuring the wrong thing, is no good. But it can still be useful. It may be wrong, but it can be useful if we start to measure the right thing. So what are the tools we'll be looking at? The modern strategy tools from the point of view of this understanding of measurement. We'll obviously be looking at PESTLE, looking at something called the competitive environment in the public sector, and we're looking at 4 links. There are others, you may find others yourself and you may want to consider them. It's important though to think about this idea that there are all of them have their advantages, all of them have their disadvantages. And so I think it's very important to remember it's not the theory of the models, the reason, but it's how to implement them that we'll be looking at. We can understand if we can implement them and we'll use them, then actually whether they're right or wrong is not so important, but it may well be that we can learn useful things from them. So another word that we use for external audit is environmental scanning. And using environmental scanning, we're looking to identify clearly the opportunities and threats. As we learn more about strategy, you'll see that environmental scanning, external audit, etc., whatever you choose to call it, leads you forwards to implementing it in what we will look at further ways of analysis and evaluation. And this is part of that. This is the external things, part of the what might be called the things to be a SWOT or a TOES analysis, the opportunities of threats areas. But there are also other things you're looking at. And one thing you can clearly look for is what needs doing that is not being done. And we refer to those things as strategic gaps. It might not be an opportunity or threat, but it might well be something out there that needs to be done and it isn't being done. And that's one of the things that we're looking for. So we're trying to think about that when we're taking these measurements and understanding of these measurements. As has been noted repeatedly elsewhere, is we often refer to things about environmental attitudes. We talk about the environmental elements of pests and pestles, etc. But actually, Earth, as it was called by Sun Tzu, which is effectively environment, is much more than that. It may be distances in great and small, but it's also more ephemeral things like danger and security, and it might be chances of life and death, etc. We can read that as success and failure, and how we're going to measure those and how we're going to understand them going forward. But it's also, of course, the sort of physical environment. You must understand all these sort of things that are going forward. So the main tool we'll use for this is Pestle, which is obviously is available in a separate video. The point of this is to bring it together, this video. It is not the one, so if you look elsewhere, there are a number of Pestle videos, including one done by myself. I explain the use of Pestle. And it's important when we're doing that, however, that we must understand that the Earth environment is much broader than the physical environment. Sometimes Pestle will refer to ecological issues, which is more narrow, which is more towards the greener ideas, etc. But in that case, there will probably be a much longer set of letters than just simply a pest or pastel. There are various things that there's a steep, etc. that can be used. So you have to look out for all of these that are different ones. But it's understanding the broader picture for a pestle is to understand that if you really understand the environment, it's much more than that. Again, to refer to the American War in Vietnam, which is a lesson that never stops giving, that GIAP actually understood US citizens' attitudes better than the US military did to a certain extent. The US military assumed the American people would support their military, and they do to a greater extent. The myth of soldiers being attacked and spat at when they came home is a post-war myth. The reality is most people, even the people against the war, supported the US military, but in the end they didn't think the casualty rate was worth taking. They as GIAP himself said, the American people do not tolerate long wars. It's also understanding the way things link together, and one of the lessons we have from history is the way that different organisations try and link them together. So going back to the 60s again, we see things like the Irish Civil Rights Movement, which was campaigning for Catholic emancipation in Ireland, took its name from the US Civil Rights Movement because that was the famous one, and they were trying to make those deliberate links between Irish civil rights and the US civil rights. We think that they did great and successfully and actually helped to build both organisations. The Gay Liberation Front was much more direct. It came around at the late 60s at a time of the Vietnam War, and it took its name from the Vietnam Liberation Front. So it's actually very important to understand the significant name and the links they make. So those are people who understood the very broad environment that they could use to their benefit. Going on to more modern times, we see that, and we'll talk about it later, in the idea of Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd and their relationships, and Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières, where often these organisations, the bigger, more popular organisations, criticise the small organisations, but have the sort of relationship that allows the smaller organisations to do what the bigger organisation cannot do without damaging some of its reputations going forward. So we need to consider about this. The other thing we need to understand is what is happening and changing in the battle. This is where Sun Tzu referred to knowing the place and time of the cunning battle. We may concentrate the greatest distances in order to fight, but planning in advance by having some understanding of what's likely to understand, so having some understanding of the changing trends of things that are going to be coming up. So at the moment we look at what's going on in the external environment for ourselves if we're doing planning. And of course a major change is from the globalisation of public services. At the moment most countries are adopting a situation where people can bid to deliver services for the countries. Within the United Kingdom we see large numbers of services being delivered by French and German and US companies, not just manufacturing but actual services as well. We look at the flow of economic migrants, where people are moving to where jobs are. We actually, of course, in the United Kingdom we've reduced that, or trying to reduce that, but whether that be successful or not as we go through Brexit. But the reality is that there's very much a free flow of labour across the world, both legal and illegal, and it's important that we work to make sure that the system actually works to the benefit of the majority of people. There is an ageing population across the world. It's one of the reasons why many people are having to move to get work, why people are having to accept immigration even if they are actively supposedly campaigning against it, because we cannot find enough people to do the work locally. There is a rising level of consumer expectations. Now, there's an idea that people have greater requirements from what they receive, that there are much more services in which people are expecting to receive what they think is going on. And of course, the rise of information technology is a very, very important one. But also the idea that we're going away from pure private, pure public partnership sector often into a more partnership-based approach. We've got private and public sector partnerships working together in doing this. It's also important to elements that all these elements come out in different levels of power. They're not always of the same import. As time moves on, you must work out what is most appropriate for the present time and what is less appropriate for the present time. These are very important points. Okay. Sun Tzu talked about the 5 elements, and he talked about the idea of long and short days, and he talked about the moon's period of wax and waning, but also he was talking about was actually environmental change. And this is very characteristic of external audit, that we have to understand that the level of stability can be very variable. And the things we need to look at, ideas of diversity. There are many, many different influences, especially on the public sector. Whereas business strategy might be about selling more of a service or a good, quite often the public sector is about a variety of people. The people paying for the service might also not be the people receiving the service. So the people paying for it want it done cheaply, the people receiving it want it done well, etc. And that is just one of the more simplest of the complexities, where some people want different things doing. For instance, the prison service, some people will want good treatment and rehabilitation, other people want punishment and long sentences, etc. So these are all these different influences that have to be considered. There's a very great complexity in these, in the way that these influences are interconnected, and outcomes maybe are a long way down the line, and trying to get people to stay to a change until the outcomes actually influences, especially if you look at the influences, say for instance, on primary education. It might be 15 years before you start to see improved outcomes among people, and it's very difficult to get people to stand and actually accept that. And one of the problems in education there is constancy of change. There's massive speed of change, particularly information and communication technologies, but not simply there. There are many other areas, and of course there's massive globalization itself. And I suggest you look for a small video called Resistance Is It Futile, that looks at some of the ways that people actually can stand up towards this. The idea often pushed is that globalization is the juggernaut that cannot be stopped. It may not be stopped, but it certainly can be adapted and changed. And in fact, in many ways, it isn't that new. It's certainly been around for at least 200 years. It may well have been around for much longer than that. And there have been phases of globalization and types of globalization, so it isn't all just about one approach. Also important, the things we're looking at when we look at these various things of external audit, is if we're going to work with some of the neighbours. And the point about public sector strategy, which makes it more interesting in my opinion than business strategy, is the fact there is a lot more cooperation and a lot more alliances. And like I said, those alliances might not always be as clean, as straightforward as they were. So it's very interesting to look at the competitive environment of the public sector, for which, again, I've made a separate video. If you'd like to search that out, it is available, and have a look at that. So you want to look at things, you want to identify those rival organisations, those organisations that might be even working against you. And you also want to understand their strengths and their weaknesses. They are part of the environment. You want to understand what their capabilities are, what is it they can do that may be better than yours. But actually, it may to understand their objectives. Maybe there are things in which organisations may be rivals, but they have similar objectives to you. They may be rivals for funding, they may be rivals for support, they may be rivals for votes. There may be a number of things that makes them rivals. It may also be that organisations with very different objectives to you that are not actually rivals, because they may be working in different ways, and you may be able to bring things together. It may also be possible that there are organisations, as we talked about before, that actually suggest that there are things that are potentially likely to change. And so it might be the idea to bring people together, to work together. Some of these rivals may actually be potential collaborators, and it's important to look in the same way, look what their strengths and weaknesses, capabilities and objectives are. But it's also true that there may be some organisations that actually are trying to do very similar to you, but by trying to block you or be a different end to the same means. And it may be about popularity or funding, etc., that can cause these differences. in the way you go about trying to achieve things. So these are very important to remember. All of those things are very important. And so it's very important to understand, we need to understand what those organisations around us are doing if we were to link up with them. And again, the 4 links module, for which I've made a separate video, details one way of doing this. I think it's quite important. So you're looking for the trends and influences that might affect political allies. You're looking for how you might work with people. You're looking for what you may go along. This may be across different countries. It may be within different countries. It may be to do with temporary alliances. It may be long-term alliance of factors. If you're going to get together into an alliance or work with people, though, make sure you understand what yours and their critical success factors are, because you need to know what it is you're both looking for the alliance. So we have to understand what it is they are looking for as well as what we're looking for, and look at ways in which you can both achieve that. It may well be that it's worth getting together as part of strategic groups. Your only link may be that you're both customers of the same organisation, or you both serve the same people, or you even the provision of services are answerable to the funding for the same people. So it might well be that there are ways, it might be that you are work together as an alliance of organisations, so like institutes or a public sector institute, etc. Or it may be that you're competitive in the way that you're actually trying to achieve funding, but it might be well that way that there are certain things that you can work together on in shaping the environment in which you operate. And again, we'll obviously talk about the Greenpeace and Red Cross stories that we'll look at later on, and they're very, very important here. Anyway, this was just a brief introduction to set the scenario for the way we consider external audit or environmental scanning, whichever we want to look at it. So I'd just like to say, of course, thank you for listening. Hello, welcome to a lecture introducing the concept of external audit. We're just going to be looking at it in this short video, some of the influences of that, and understand that. Learn more about strategy. You'll see to the fact that there are things that we can find in common and work together on. So let's proceed onwards. First we look at this idea of measurement and why is it important, and why is it important today, the things that we'll be looking at.